All right, so this evening we have sort of two things we're going to look at for the time. So they're slightly different, but they're of course on the same topic of loving our neighbors, and hopefully we'll see how these connect in the time that we have. So far in talking about loving our neighbors, we have really focused on the idea of loving at the level of individuals. So we've talked about some of the list last week. How do you talk to someone? What do you say? Practicing hospitality. And hopefully on the back of that sheet, the first couple of weeks, I encourage you to write down names of your neighbors. So hopefully you've got names of individuals, faces in mind that you think of when you think of your neighbors. I mentioned Tom across the street. To the other side of me, I have a man named Tommy. So we've got Tom and Tommy. Very different Tom and Tommy. In fact, they're very opposite. And so every neighbor is slightly different, right? And so you got to approach them differently, and we want to think in terms of those individuals. But if we stop there and only think about loving individuals, I'm not sure we've done everything that God has called us to do. And so I want to talk tonight, at least for our first half, talk about how neighboring can even go beyond people. You say, what does that mean? I want to argue that we can also love our neighbors by loving our neighborhoods. All right? Love our neighbors by loving our neighborhoods. Remember when we talked about Jesus' ministry, what did Jesus do? Jesus had a twofold ministry. It was a message ministry and a mercy ministry, right? He was preaching and he was healing and casting out demons and so forth, right? So, and when Jesus does that, it's interesting when he first starts. If Luke's gospel is indicating this, the first place he does this was in his hometown of Nazareth, right? He is known as Jesus of Nazareth. There was a lot of Jesuses walking around. So specifically, we would probably not know Nazareth if it wasn't for Jesus. It was such a small place, right? Remember, can anything good come out of Nazareth, right? Such an overlooked place, and yet Jesus sort of puts it on the map. And in Luke chapter 4, his very first sermon was at the synagogue in Nazareth. And his first miracles, some of the first things he does happens in that region, right? So I think it's interesting to think about, this is the place he grew up. And didn't they say, is this the carpenter's son? Right? This was his actual neighborhood. This was the synagogue it was his custom, it says, to go to. So they knew him in the community, and this was the place that he went to first. And I think that's a good reminder to us that our own neighborhoods, our own communities are where we should start. Now, by the way, a little asterisk. They tried to kill him. So be ready, right? It doesn't always go well, right? But he was literally loving his neighborhood. He was loving the people of Nazareth. And so when we talk about loving our neighbors, it can be at the level of the individuals, but I want to remind us that it can even go beyond that in loving ways that are related to our neighbors as a whole. So even being involved, and again, these might not cross our minds, we may not think this is like a loving thing, but being involved in like a homeowners association, right? How we engage in that, how we conduct ourselves, the input we give can actually be loving to the whole community and is actually beneficial to those around us. Being involved in maybe a school district, right? Being involved and helpful in some other local program or business can actually be a way in which we're actually loving our neighbors. And I want to show that, not from this passage, we're going to come back to this, I promise, but go back with me to the book of Jeremiah for a few moments. So if you do have a Bible, turn back to Jeremiah chapter 29. Jeremiah chapter 29, and I'm going to start reading in verse 4. We all remember Jeremiah, of course, he was the prophet of Lamentations that we just studied on Sundays. Notice verse 4, it says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel," and notice who he's writing to here, "to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." All right, so this is the people that were taken out of the land, taken off into exile. And he gives them some commands. What do they do in exile? Build houses and live in them, and plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and become the fathers of sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters and multiply there and do not decrease. So God has sent them into exile, and now he gives them a word. Here's how you live as exiles. Right? This is what you do. And notice verse 7, he tells them and commands them, seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare, you will have welfare. It's sometimes peace. Seek the peace of the city, but it's like seek the good of the place in which you are. Now think about that. They're not in Jerusalem. They're not in Zion. They're in Babylon. Talk about terrible neighbors. Right? Talk about a rambunctious neighborhood to be in, right? And yet God tells them to seek the welfare, the good, the shalom of the place in which you are, the prosperity of that place, right? So that, because if they prosper, you prosper, right? Because you do live there. Now, I think there's several things that we can think about this. First of all, notice back in verse 5, he says, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce. Right? So literally some of the basic things you would have in caring for your home and your neighborhood, he's commanding Israel to do this.
It is shalom.
Shalom. Yeah. Excellent. Yes. But that has the idea of wholeness, not just like no war. It's like seek the wholeness, the health, the good of the place in which you are. And so this is a very interesting idea here, because it would have been easy in exile just to like pull back and have nothing to do with those around you, right? Because we're God's people and you're God's enemies, so be it. But God was actually saying, no, you should actually pray for them. Now, here's what's interesting, if you keep reading Jeremiah, their ultimate goal, though, was not like make Babylon prosperous again, okay? Because he actually in a couple chapters is going to say, get ready, it's going to all come crashing down, okay? So the ultimate goal here is not just make things good for Babylon for the sake of Babylon, but he's saying if you're a stranger, if you're in exile, if you're a guest somewhere, think of it that way. Right? If you're staying in someone's home and you're a guest, you should be a good guest. Don't smash the place. Leave it in good condition. Right? My mom would tell you, if you make a mess, clean it up. Right? Leave it in a better place than you are. And in some ways, that's what they're told to do, even when they're the one that's in this foreign land. So doing those kinds of things, I think, are a helpful reminder to us. Can anybody think of other examples of someone living in a foreign land that did good for the place in which they were? Daniel, yes, right? Who else? Joseph, right? Joseph came up with like a welfare system to make the entire nation not starve to death, right? And a lot of these people, I mean, most of these people, right, were pagans and worshiped the sun and whatever else, and yet they prospered in the nation. They were cared for through his faithfulness to God. And so if in that sense, in this kind of sense, they were living as exiles, right? So it's not that we think, oh, building my city is the same as building Christ's kingdom. That's not the same thing, right? But recognizing that as exiles, as strangers, we are guests, right? We're only here temporarily, and God has called us to care even for those around us. When I go out to mow the grass, this is the kind of stupid jokes my wife has to put up with. I don't tell her I'm going out to mow the lawn. I tell her I'm going to fulfill my Adamic obligation as an Adam, right? To tend to keep the garden. First time I said it, she goes, "You're what?" I said, Adamic, as in Adam. It's an adjective. Adam's obligation, right? To tend and keep the garden because, right? That's part of our creation care, that we should care for the world in which God's placed us. So, or even sharing what you have in your own garden, right? If it's not something that you have access to everything, but being able to do that. So, yeah, there's lots of ideas, things that we can do to make that happen. So on the back of your sheet there, I want you to flip it over real quick. And I want to point you to something. I don't want to spend time unpacking this. I just want to kind of read it because It's the Baptist Faith and Message, and we should read this more often. I know we don't read it enough. This is Article 15. It's called the Christian and Social Order. I don't know if you've read this. I seriously would encourage you to. But I just want to read through it and listen to some of what it says. It says, all Christians are under obligation to seek to make the will of Christ supreme in our own lives and in human society. And that starts in our neighborhoods, I would say. Means and methods used for the improvement of society and the establishment of righteousness among men can be truly and permanently helpful only when they are rooted in the regeneration of the individual by the saving grace of God in Jesus Christ. In other words, the ultimate goal, right, is to see men, women, boys and girls come to faith in Christ. And the way in which, notice it says, in the spirit of Christ, Christians should oppose racism, every form of greed, selfishness, and vice, and all forms of sexual immorality, including adultery, homosexuality, and pornography. We should work to provide for the orphaned, the needy, the abused, the aged, the helpless, and the sick. We should speak on behalf of the unborn and contend for the sanctity of all human life from conception to natural death. Now, we tend to think of these in political terms, which I understand because that's how many of us do these things, but there are ways in our neighborhoods and communities, groups we can be part of that's part of this. Now, listen to the next sentence. I love this one. Every Christian should seek to bring industry, government, and society as a whole under the sway of the principles of righteousness, truth, and brotherly love. In order to promote these ends, Christians should be ready to work with all men of goodwill in any good cause, always being careful to act in the spirit of love without compromising their loyalty to Christ and His truth. I think that's a wonderful summary of what we should be aiming to do, both in terms of restraining what's bad in our society, but also promoting what's good in our society. I know Christians are sometimes divided on these questions of political and social involvement, but I think this strikes at the balance of what we should be about. That ultimately we know that people need the gospel, they need Christ. But we also have an obligation to love our neighbors and to care for them and to do those things as we have opportunity. So as I was thinking about this, I thought of another example. Do you know the book of Proverbs talks about the things that God hates? We think, well, God hates lying, God hates stealing. But, you know, Proverbs 11 says, that a false balance is an abomination to the Lord. Okay? You know what that means? It means if you are part of or own a small business, right, be honest. Don't inflate your prices. Make sure the fine print is not trying to get one over on people, right? That's actually loving your neighborhood. And God hates false balances. He hates people getting taken advantage of in the marketplace, is what he's saying there. And so by loving the truth, right, and living that out, we're actually showing love to our neighborhood. So it isn't that this always has to be in evangelistic terms, although again, that's ultimately what we want. But if somebody finds that you're a person of truth and integrity and that you're a Christian, how much more then does it support the work that we're seeking to do? I think so. And I think every Christian, it'd be good to be known as that and that we should value that as well. So if you see, I'm going to use kind of an odd phrase here, structural problems, trash, right? I'm not saying go fill a pothole like with a, steamroller or something like that. It's probably not how you do it. But my brother-in-law, he doesn't live here, lives in Ohio, in Columbus. And years ago, a little suburb there, he was telling me that they had some break-ins in their neighborhood. It was a couple years ago. And, he and some guys, some people in the neighborhood talked about starting like a neighborhood watch just to do something, just kind of deter this crime. And I remember him telling me that one of the guys, as a result of this, started going to church because some of the guys from the neighborhood went to the church and they would talk about it and he would see and hear this and that made an impression on him. And they were doing something good for the neighborhood and it ended up stopping, if I understand. I don't think that they're still doing it to this day. And yet God was able to use that in that way. So how do you love your neighbor? Well, you can love your neighbor by loving your neighborhood. All right? So think about ways you can do that this week. Lastly, and one last thought for a few moments before we wrap up here, that we love your neighbor by loving your neighborhood, and you love your neighbor by loving your church. Love your neighbor by loving your church. So back to John chapter 13, if you want to turn back there. I know I had you read this passage earlier. Notice again verse 35. Jesus says, "By this all men will know that you are my disciples." He doesn't just say, "if you have love," period. Okay? Sometimes we want to stop it there. Remember earlier we talked about, well, I love everybody. Sometimes that's an excuse for loving nobody. Okay? But Jesus specifically says, if you have love for one another. Now, I've explained this before, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but that phrase, one another, in the New Testament is code language. Okay? And when you see that, you can think either other Christians, or in most cases in the epistles, it means fellow church members, right? They weren't as globally connected like we think of today. And so when he says, love one another, he was literally thinking about the people sitting to your left and right. That's what they thought of. They weren't thinking about Christians in other parts of the world, although that's certainly not wrong to do, right? He's talking about the people sitting around you. So when Jesus says here, this is the way that all men will know, so that's our neighbors. How do your neighbors know that we belong to him? By the fact that we love one another. And so I think there's a sense in which the church is itself a tremendous way to love our neighbors. And if you think about it, that the church, while we're imperfect, right, the church speaks to something that it really defies like logical, normal experience. Okay? I mean, just even in this room here tonight, right? Like we've got people that are we've got baby boomers and Gen Xers and millennials and Gen Zs, right? Like, and we're all here, right, for the same purpose. And we're, as far as I know, getting along. See anybody shooting daggers across the room, right? Right? Like that sort of defies, right, the way the world talks about, right? We've got all different kinds of interests, right? All different kinds of tastes, all different kinds of backgrounds, right? And so the church shows that there's something different. And for an unbeliever to come and see that, it should say, now wait a minute, this is not natural. There's something supernatural that's happening here, right? And so I think in that sense, the church is actually one of the best tools for evangelism because it actually is a corporate witness. It's kind of like a group project. It says something more than what you can say by yourself. It's one thing to say, you should become a Christian because, man, being part of the church is amazing. It's another thing to say, hey, come see my church. And for people to experience that and to say, wow, I've not experienced this before. Now, that means we all have to mind our P's and Q's, right? We need to be loving each other. We need to be doing those things that God's called us to do, right? But there's a sense in which there's an even greater impact when the church, or excuse me, when evangelism is done in a corporate sense. So here's what I want to say. Think of it this way. We often think of evangelism as I'm person A, right? And I'm a Christian. And person B over here is my neighbor who's not a Christian, okay? So evangelism is me, person A, telling the gospel to person B, okay? That's evangelism, yes, okay? But then let's imagine I've got my church friend named person C, okay? And so person A goes to person B and says, I want to tell you the gospel. And then I come to church and I tell person C, hey, I'm sharing the gospel with this friend, okay? It's great, right? But imagine as person A, if I brought person B to meet person C. And now they get to actually see the thing that I'm talking about happen in their experience. You can tell somebody, man, the church is a place where people love and forgive, but then for them actually to experience that, right, is actually a whole nother experience in a way that demonstrates the gospel for them. And so I think that the community of the church is actually one of the most powerful tools that we have in evangelism. Imagine, using a plastic shovel to dig a trench, right? And then you sit down to rest and you sit down on the backhoe. Why would you not use the backhoe, right? If you've got it sitting there. And sometimes we're doing evangelism, we're just, I'm trying to dig and dig and dig as hard as I can. Why not actually bring the body of Christ and the people around and others, right, to help do the digging for you, if that's possible. So how do we do that? There's two things. I want to encourage you, invite your neighbors to church and invite the church to your neighbors. Okay? So let me talk about both of those real quick. I think they're pretty obvious, but let's hash them out, okay? So I want to invite my neighbors to church, okay? Now, again, evangelism specifically is more than just inviting someone to church. It is proclaiming the good news, making an appeal to repent, to believe in Jesus as your Lord and Savior, all right? But why would we not? Like, we can be sure that they will hear that message by coming to church. And if sometimes we can't put it into words, it gives them the opportunity to process and think about it. And sometimes it can be a lot easier afterwards to go to lunch and just say, so what'd you think about that? What'd you think about my pastor? Wasn't that a terrible sermon that he preached, Like, when he said this thing about Jesus, have you ever heard, right, that? And now you've got something to talk about. You don't feel the pressure's on you, but you're just having a conversation about the thing that they heard and you experienced together. So when was the last time that you invited someone to church? If your neighbors know that church is a big part of your life, then maybe they would want to be part of that or experience, why is it such a big, why do they go on Wednesday nights? Like, what's happening there? Like, what is that thing, right? So how would you make that known? Well, invite them to come be part of it. By the way, I don't think this is just a side note here. I don't have time for a side note, but I'm going to time for a side note. So maybe this is for the future for most of you in this room, but so here's my encouragement in this. Just in the same way that a green apple is green and a fuzzy poodle is fuzzy, so too a local church should be local. Okay? I think this is really hard to do if you're driving 30 minutes to church. Do anybody remember, I know a couple, do you remember the Moses family? Do you remember the Moses? Heather and, what was his name? Robert, yes, that's right. I'll think of it all day. Robert.
Tara and I knew them really well.
The Moses, amazing family in our church. They were involved, they were connected, they were Sunday school, they served, they were just such wonderful people, right? Here, served all the time. They moved, bought a house in like Amherst, Nelson County, somewhere that way. Kept driving like 38 minutes or something to church, right? Still is involved Sunday morning, all the stuff, right? And then literally they came to me and said, Pastor, we want to talk to you. And I said, what? And they said, we think we might have to change churches. Well, I was obviously heartbroken to hear that because I don't want anybody to leave. And I said, but the way they said, I said, why? They said, because we were talking to our neighbor the other day and we said, you should come to church with us. And my neighbor said, where do you go to church? And they said, Forest Baptist Church. And their neighbor said, what? You expect me to drive 38 minutes to go to church with you? And they said, we all kind of laughed and we went home and thought, yeah, that's kind of ridiculous. Like, if we're going to meet our people in our neighborhood, maybe we should be part of a church in our neighborhood, right? So as much as I hated to see them go, I was so thrilled to see them go because the work of the kingdom is that. And so if you're driving 20, 30 minutes to church, right? Now, again, I know most of us have cars. It's pretty easy to get around nowadays. But you're passing 35 churches, right, to get there. The best way to love your neighborhood is to be one where you're connected to where your neighborhood is. So that's a little side note there. So how do you invite people? Well, you know how to invite people, right? Invite them to service. If you invite them, make it as easy as possible. Offer to bring them, right? Offer to take them to lunch afterwards, right? Just make it worthwhile their time, right? Offer to make sure to meet them at a certain door so they know, because some people, if they haven't been in church, they don't even know, what door do I go in? Do I have to do something? Do they ask me for money? Like prepare them if need be for some of those things. And make sure that you extend that invitation. We obviously have attractional special events like our Fall Festival and VBS, those kinds of things. If you've been here on Christmas Eve, like 70% of people here have nothing to do with Forest Baptist Church. It's amazing, right? I don't see most of you here. No, I'm just kidding. Like seriously, it's so many visitors on Christmas Eve, right? That's a wonderful time to invite people. So I know, some of you have been Christians for years. You say, well, I've tried it before. Think about it again and see. So that's inviting your neighbor to church. Okay. But what about the flip side, real quick? How do you invite the church into the life of your neighbors? Think about this. Sometimes we don't mix our social circles very well. We think in terms of these are my church friends, and I see them on Sundays and Wednesdays, and that's church. And then these are my work friends, or these are my neighborhood friends, or my softball friends, or whatever you do on the side here. And it's easy sometimes to kind of keep our lives separated that way. But why not find a way to mix those social circles together? So if you have a cookout at your house and you're inviting a couple over from your Sunday school class, why not make that the time to invite a neighbor over and invite them to join you as well? And not just to ambush them, all right, although that could be, part of the conversation, but an opportunity for them to see the church, our relationship as brothers and sisters lived out in front of their eyes, and to experience there's something different here between them. By the way, anytime I meet a new person at our church, and I would encourage all of you to do this, okay? Anytime I meet somebody new at our church, and especially if they're new to the community, right? I say, so, first time here? And they say, yeah. And I say, where are you from? I'll say, are you new to the community, or are you just looking for a church? I'll say, oh, I just moved here from Pennsylvania. I just moved here from West Virginia, wherever. Every conversation, I try, 99% of the time, I end the conversation by saying, listen, I know it's hard moving to a new community. And whether you come to Forest or not, that's up to God, but we want to be good neighbors. So if you need a doctor or a mechanic, or you're looking for, a chiropractor, please give me a call. Just call the church. Just reach out to me, because I know it's hard. We want to be good neighbors. And I had so many people, oh, wow, thank you. I haven't thought about that. Or, yeah, I need a dentist, or I need this. And it's a great opportunity to do that. Some of you know the Stemmels, Julie and David Stemmel. I had that conversation with them Sunday morning. She called me Sunday night. And I said she needed a certain doctor. I said, hey, I think my wife knows. And they talked all week long. And guess what? They were in the next new members class just a few weeks later. So I'm not saying that's a guarantee, but I'm just saying if you meet people that are new to the area, offer to be a good neighbor. I can help you I can recommend a guy for you for this. And it just shows a way of loving your neighborhood and those around you. All right. I know I did it again. I'm going to say this real fast, and then I'm going to finish. Two things with that. When it comes to inviting the church to your neighbors, okay, two things I'm going to say. Number one, I'm going to balance them out. Number one, I think it's okay to, if I could use the phrase, pre-wire a conversation. As in, if you're inviting your church friend over, right, to be part of this, to say, hey, this is my neighbor. He's not a Christian, or here's a little bit of his background, right? And I've been praying for him, and I just want you to know that, right? I've been trying to share the gospel with him. Maybe try to invite him to something. He's not really come, but, I think that's fine. All right, I think that's good so that you know and that you can be prayerful in that regard as well. At the same time, I would say don't make your neighbors evangelistic projects, right? You ever been to somebody's home for a dinner and then you realize it's a pyramid scheme? And you go, oh no, I need to get out of here, right? Right? Don't make your neighbors feel like that, right? They walk in and there's 14 people from church, all with Bibles and tracts, and they're thinking, what did I sign up for? Okay? So don't ambush them in that way. I think you can do that wrong, right? But if it's a game night, if it's a cookout, if it's a block party, if it's a yard sale, think of ways that you can sort of cross-pollinate. Who from the church, in my small group, my Sunday school class, could I have over? Well, I'm going to have these people over. And just see what God does in those situations. And so bring your neighbors to church, and bring the church to